I love it low.
Say love lies in a lot of love, hanging on with a push and shove. Possession is the motivation. It's hanging up the goddamn nation. It looks like we always end up in a rut. Hey, trying to make
Yeah. How y'all doing today? All right. Give it up for To Be Continued Brass Band, y'all. Put your hands together. So good afternoon. My name is Christy Slater. I'm a program officer with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And on behalf of the Kellogg Foundation and the local and national advisory committees for a gathering of leaders, it is my honor to welcome you to New Orleans. All right, now. At the Kellogg Foundation, we work to ensure that all children have opportunities to thrive. I'm sorry, I was dancing too hard, so I'm out of breath. A big part of that work is affirming, developing, and supporting the vibrant and talented young men of color in our communities. It is my honor to do that work here in my hometown. This is a special place with time-honored traditions like brass band, an ensemble with roots in the sort of jazz played here long before it migrated across the country and the world. We just got a little taste of that today, just now with the To Be Continued Brass Band. So I'd like to keep that same energy going as I introduce to you the host of the 4th annual Gathering of Leaders. Tremaine Lee is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and national reporter for MSNBC. For more than a dozen years, he has chronicled the role of race, violence, law enforcement, and politics in the lives of everyday Americans. Before joining MSNBC, Lee was a reporter with the Huffington Post, where he broke the story of Trayvon Martin in 2012 to a national audience. Prior to that, he was a reporter for the New York Times, but most importantly, in my humble opinion, he was a reporter right here in New Orleans for the New Orleans-based Times-Picayune, where he received his first Pulitzer as part of the team covering the fallout from Hurricane Katrina. In fact, in the days following the storm, he spent a night hunkered down in this very hotel with its windows blown out and no power or water so he could cover the real stories on the ground as people in this community struggled to survive. It is fitting that Tremaine hosts this gathering. He understands both the struggle men and boys face in this country and in New Orleans. As many of you got to see on the learning tours today, our city is rising to meet its challenges. We, like all of you, are working together to move forward. And it is with that spirit of resilience that I'm happy to introduce Mr. Tremaine Lee.
Thank you very much. Now, I know y'all came from far and wide, but only New Orleans could welcome you home like that. That was beautiful. The To Be Continued Brass Band. It is truly my pleasure and my honor to be your MC for this conference. I've spent a long time on the front lines reporting on issues that are really all-encompassing of the work so many of you do here in this room. And so the one thing I've learned, though, through it all, is that it is vital, it's critical, that leaders like all of you and all of those who have tuned in from far and wide continue to talk to each other, engage, and sometimes even argue about the best ways to move forward. Now, for the context of this room and those who, again, are tuning in, we want this to be a far-reaching and robust conversation. So if you haven't downloaded the app, do it now. It's a beautiful, beautiful work of art. But also, most of our Q&As will be conducted via social media. So when something strikes you as interesting or you have a question throughout our panels, make sure you use the hashtag AGOL15. That's hashtag AGOL15. Now, this first panel will be forward-looking, beyond just this moment, beyond the waning days of President Obama's presidency and his My Brother's Keeper initiative, even beyond the robust media coverage around race right now. The conversation will be about how do we go from this moment to a movement, to something that looks like real, lasting change in America. And so I am pleased to be joined by 6 really incredible and dynamic leaders from across the country. First, we have Frank Lopez. He's a hip-hop artist, educator, and resident filmmaker at the Brotherhood Sister Soul, working on a series of films focusing on efforts towards fair and just policing in New York City, with a BFA in film and television from New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. Good to see you, bro. Next, we have Macy Chin, Executive Director and co-founder of CADRE, which is the Community Asset Development Redefining Education. CADRE fights to end the push-out of low-income families of color from public schools into the school-to-prison pipeline. She's also a board member of Justice Matters Press, a social and racial justice press by and for people of color. Next, we have Angela Glover Blackwell, founder and CEO of PolicyLink. PolicyLink is a research and advocacy organization dedicated to the American nonprofit sector to advance economic and social equity. Prior to founding PolicyLink, Blackwell served as senior vice president at the Rockefeller Foundation, where she oversaw the foundation's domestic and cultural divisions. Next up, we have Raymond Foxworth, VP of Grantmaking, Development, and Communications at First Nations Development Institute. He serves on the board of directors of Native Public Media, located in Flagstaff, Arizona, which develops projects focused on native food systems, family economic security, and strengthening the nonprofit sector in Indian country. Next, we have Michael Smith, Special Assistant to President Obama, where he manages President Obama's My Brother's Keeper initiative to address persistent opportunity gaps faced by boys and young men of color, and to ensure that all young people can reach their full potential. Prior to joining the White House team, Michael was an appointee in the Obama administration, serving as director of the Social Innovation Fund. And before joining the Obama administration, Michael served as senior VP of Social Innovation at the Case Foundation. And last, but certainly not least, I welcome Achila Roque, Director of Amnesty International Brazil, as well as the Executive Director of INESC, which is the Institute for Economic and Social Studies. He is a social and environmental justice advocate and one of the founders of the World Social Forum. So let's give our panelists another round of applause. Now, Frank, I want to start with you. You're kind of our Renaissance man here. You're an actor, a rapper, an educator, an activist, an organizer. Now, primarily your work has focused on policing issues in New York City, but also that work is stretched across the country and the world. For you, what do you see as the essential elements of this movement? And also, what might these efforts signal about where we're headed? What might be ahead of us?
First of all, I just want to say I'm super grateful to be in this room with such amazing, powerful people doing such great work that is directly impacting the lives of young men, young girls of color throughout the country. So I was thinking to myself before I got here, just gratitude for being in this space. I start off by saying that because I'm thankful to the organization that brought me into the work, the Brotherhood Sister Soul. I was just a young kid, 16 years old, and I like to rhyme. And when Sean Bell was killed in 2005, the Mahita movement, a group in New York City, put out a call to artists, 50 shots, 50 artists, to come out. I decided to write a piece. I felt impacted by the story. I felt I wanted to speak up. And so when I went to that event and did a poem, there was a man in the back of the room that came up to me after and said, "Hey, I would really love if you shared that piece at my son's memorial service." That man was Nicholas Hayward Sr. His son, Nicholas Hayward Jr., was shot and killed in the Gowanus projects 20 years ago while playing cops and robbers. This past weekend, Nicholas celebrated his wedding. And I think that one of the elements that I've learned is extremely important from the youth organization that I've been blessed to be a part of, but also the people and the families that I've met throughout these years being a community organizer around policing issues in New York City, has been community. That we're there for each other in more ways than just being out in the streets. It's breaking bread. It's knowing names and knowing stories. It's building with their children as well, and knowing that we're not alone. I think another element is the ability to have young people's voices be at the forefront. And I think that we're seeing that throughout the country. I'm proud to say that there's curriculum being implemented into New York City public schools around Black Lives Matter, around the killings of young people throughout this country, and putting that into an education that I think that is missing from the curriculum as well. And lastly, to just say what I see now, I think is exactly that: young people's voices rising up and them stepping into their own power.
Macy, a lot of what Frank just said speaks to the heart of what fuels so many people to become active in their communities. It's about the young people. It's about a sense of community. It's about a sense of upliftment. In your work in LA, you work with a 300-member parent organization to try to help save so many young people from slipping into the school-to-prison pipeline. And clearly that can be weighty and depressing because we lose too many of our young people. But can you speak to some of the victories, some of the wins, and what's really at stake, and what matters when you're actually making those gains?
And I echo Frank in saying it's an honor to be here. There are a lot of our colleagues here in the audience, and so it is fantastic to be here. And I actually want to compliment what Frank said. Sure, my friends, our friends are here from LA and California know that we've made some huge strides in LA. Since 2005, when Cadre first started working to fight school push-out by organizing parents, suspensions have gone down over 90%. And we're almost eradicating, to some degree, the racial disproportionality rate of African American students as well, except on individual school campuses. So district-wide, yes, but on individual school campuses. And when our parents, monitor the implementation of all the policy victories that we've won, there is still a huge gap. So I think in all success, it really prepares us for the next frontline struggle. And I want to echo what Frank said about what it means to work with families and community, that it's so much deeper than just winning a policy or getting some stats to go down. I am quite honestly sometimes fearful about our success if it's just seen through the stats. For us, we work and only work with parents. We work with a lot of allies that organize young people, but we certainly have focused on working with parents solely, and we certainly have allies in all of our coalitions that also work with parents, but it's kind of in the shadows. It's all to support the voice of young people, but I'm here to also, add some good, healthy, creative, loving tension to our field and say that we will not win, and this matter won't matter as much unless we organize parents. And I don't mean just organize them to show up at a school board. I mean to invest heavily in the development as human beings and change agents and leaders of community and family, just like we do so much and so often for young people. I think the work of Brotherhood Sister Soul has done so much to advance the depth of what that work looks like, and I think the same needs to be done with our parents. And at the end of the day, all of our victories just point to the fact that we have an incredible amount of some of the hardest restoration work to do, which is restoring families, restoring intergenerational relationships, restoring culture. There's workshops on this year's gathering that I think are provocative, revolutionary Black parenting, cultura cura. We have to go beyond the stats, and I hope that all of us who are in this room see that there's a new frontier, that we have to include parents, and we have to go beyond bringing down suspensions. And hopefully all of the work that we're doing in LA is truly going to push that envelope on behalf of this entire movement.
Thank you. Achala, in your work in Brazil, and you could probably replace what's happened in Brazil throughout the colonized world, when you think about the racism, the police violence, restoring parts of the culture that have been lost, stolen, or strayed, when you think about what's happening in Brazil, especially as it relates to the Afro-Brazilian community and their allies, what kinds of unique challenges do you all face, and how are some of those challenges similar to what so many are facing here in America?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. It's great to be in this great city of New Orleans. I'm feeling connected to New Orleans because 10 years ago I was actually living in the US. So I follow daily the suffering and the struggle of people in this city. So I feel as being here is quite emotional for me. Well, I think we can say a couple of things as a start. In terms of common things, common realities, we have three dimensions, which is very much in Brazil and here. One is a very selective justice system. Justice is not equal to everyone. That's one important dimension. A very selective routine of violence. Violence is part of the Brazilian life from the very beginning, but it's not violence to everyone. Violence on few, on some. Violence within the society and violence from the state against some people. And the third dimension is racism. Is a dimension that Brazilians don't like to talk about. Very recently we incorporate that in our public discourse, but it's very much part of the way the power and inequalities are structured in Brazil. The difference maybe in the challenge is the wall of invisibility which hiding all those facts. And in order to underline that, I would like to mention to you two names, which no one of you probably know. Christian Soares. Christian Soares, it was a 13-year-old boy who was killed a week ago, last Sunday, from Saturday to Sunday, in Rio de Janeiro by the police. You heard about Michael Brown. We in Brazil heard about Michael Brown for a month, every day, front page in every newspaper. But Brazilians and you probably know nothing about Christian Soares, as we don't know nothing about Eduardo de Jesus, another 12-year-old boy who also was killed by the police when we mistook his cell phone as a gun. So the challenge today for us is to, as we deal with the selective justice, selective violence, and racism, how we bridge and beyond the pain of those who are suffering those loss, the mothers, the children, the community, and how we can make that the problem of everyone, not only everyone in Brazil, but everyone in the world. How we make Michael Brown issue, the police violence, the militarization in the US, a common issue for us in Brazil. How we join together Afro-Americans in the US, Afro-Brazilians in Brazil, and take the human rights struggle as our utopia and our way towards solidarity, as our way to build together a new future. So that's what we are trying to do in Brazil. We are trying to do together with Amnesty International. In the US, we are exercising a great deal of creativity to build, bridge, and to learn and exchange and work together on those issues. So thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Raymond, Achala brought up some very interesting points, especially this notion that these incidents of violence or day-to-day violence happen in some sort of vacuum, and that some communities are left kind of on satellites, isolated. Now, you invest in communities that are socially, economically, and geographically isolated. And we don't often hear about the plight of what's happening in an Indian country. We know the Mike Browns, we know what's happening in the big cities. How do you and the folks you fund work to elevate the issues that are happening in Indian country, even when no one else knows they exist? And what are those particular challenges of what's going on in that part of the world?
Well, when we talk, first of all, I have to say it's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to be on this great panel with such a great group of individuals. So thank you for having me, to the organizers of the conference. At First Nations, we invest in asset-based modes of development and modes of development that are culturally based and that are community-based and community-driven. When the brother from Brazil talks about, invisibility, I think, that type of conversation is applicable to when we talk about Native communities and rural areas in general, especially when it comes to this work. You also talked a little bit about the colonized world. I think when we talk about the disempowerment or the marginalization of young boys and men in Indian country, we can't forget that process of colonization directly impacted, young boys and men in Native communities. And that process not only affected the way boys and men interact with one another, but also affected the way that boys and men interact with women, the way that children and elders interact with one another, and really just changed that, in many ways, that whole social system. And I mention that process of colonization not because it defines us, who we are today, but rather we have to acknowledge it and accept it to begin to develop pathways forward. And I also mention it because I think that I think the assumption in many instances is that didn't happen here, or that process is long gone, but those colonial pathologies still exist today. When we talk about some of the similarities in terms of your question, there are certainly many similarities. This year there was a report that was released, I forget the name of the organization, that talked about police killings and Native Americans being the most killed by police in the United States, second to African Americans and second to Latinos. And similar instances in terms of high school suspension and force out rates. So I think when we talk about those types of particular challenges, what makes some of the things in Indian country unique is that many of the solutions are based in culture, are based in tradition, are based in places that have very specific geographies. And I think those things need to be acknowledged, as well as the diversity in Indian country, that we don't all live in teepees and wear buckskin, right? That we are very different. There are over 560 Indian nations, and they all have diverse languages, customs, and traditions. And so solutions to issues facing young boys and men in Indian country are going to be diverse by reservation. So.
Angela, you've seen many iterations of these movements. And in the beginning, especially on the heels of My Brother's Keeper, there was some concern that there was kind of unbalanced focus on young men, even though we know how the stats skew. And I'm wondering from you, are we at a point where it's bigger than just focusing on our boys, or at this moment in time, we still need to spend special energy on our young men? And to look into your crystal ball, because I know you have one, right? You can tell the future. Where do you see this movement going in the very near future?
You're going to inherit $1 million tomorrow.
I like the way you think. I knew it. I like the way you think.
I can't see the future, but I definitely see a bright future for the nation if it picks up this challenge. And that's the important thing for us to keep coming back to. Frank called it right when he talked about the voices of young people rising and leading and pushing in that courageous way that only young people can do. And Maisie got it right when she talked about how much we know about what works. The good news is we're at a moment where people are calling on us to act, and we don't have to invent a whole lot because we've been doing it for decades in local communities. Local leaders and national leaders, they're solving the nation's problems. So we're building on that. And we have to put this in a narrative so that it's not about any one group, but it's about everybody. And that narrative has currency now. Look at this stage. This is the conversation that the world is having. We're all in this together, and we are different. And there's nothing wrong with difference. Difference helps you to focus. Difference helps you to bring nuance. And focusing on boys and young men of color is an opportunity for nuance, so that while we're in this moment of making the change that the nation needs for us to make, so that everybody can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential, that we bring the nuance to allow us to create a path that will make sure that everybody means everybody, including those who are most often left behind, including those who are most vulnerable. We're at a time where this nation needs the people who are being left behind more than it ever has. And if that's where we are, If the equity agenda is the national agenda, the economic imperative, the moral imperative, the democratic imperative, what that means is making sure that everybody can reach their full potential has enormous import for making sure that the nation will thrive. And if it's really important, then we need to understand the history. We need to understand the culture. We need to understand the journey. We need to understand how public policy has created this circumstance and how public policy will get us out. And we also need to know that every individual has a story, and understanding that story will help us to be able to walk in partnership. So it's not either or. I always say, if I run into somebody who's working on health, I don't ask them why they're not working on education. But I do ask them if they understand the impact that health will have on education. If you're telling me that you're working on trying to break down the over-incarceration of Black and brown and Native American young men, I'm not going to ask you why you're not working on housing. But I do want to make sure that you understand that there's a housing piece to that. So I don't have any problem with the fact that this is focused on boys and men of color, because I understand that specificity will solve this problem. And to the degree we learn how to solve this problem for one group that is vulnerable, we have more knowledge about how to solve it for all.
Excellent. Michael, Angela used a very kind of critical word that I think is so important, nuance. When My Brother's Keeper was announced, it was full of nuance. I spoke to many folks in the administration and many people who were working in this field, who were part of it, who said the greatest part about My Brother's Keeper was that it would unsilo resources, it would unsilo money and efforts and connect folks across the country. But there was concern that, one, that ultimately the money wouldn't really be dispersed throughout the country, and that at some point when Obama left office, that it would dwindle away as some sort of special project that we can put cobwebs on and forget about. We are in these last days. Are you satisfied with the work of My Brother's Keeper so far? And how do you continue, once the president is gone, to make sure you're capitalizing on all the resources and the wealth of efforts out there in the country dedicated to young men and boys of color?
Thanks for that question. I should first say, whatever Angela said, I agree with 100%. I could just push copy. You know, it's really interesting. When the president created My Brother's Keeper, there was a real appreciation for folks in this room who had been toiling away in the ground, without pomp, without circumstance, without a White House convening, for decades engaged in this work. And I think what the president was able to do was to really create a national call to action, really defining the issue from the White House and really saying whether you're a business leader, whether you're a nonprofit leader, whether you're a foundation leader, we all have a role to play here, because not only is there a moral obligation that America remains this place where if you work hard and play by the rules, we have a responsibility to help you succeed, because when you succeed, we all succeed. It's also a recognition that sometimes, no matter how hard you work, and the president talks about this, there are barriers that are in your way due to inequities that we have to knock out. And it's also, and I think what's really important that the president did, is this appreciation that it's an economic imperative. The President's Council on Economic Advisors just released a report about a month ago that showed if you were a Black boy born 25 years ago, you have roughly a 1 in 2 chance of being employed today. And that's due to early death, incarceration, and all sorts of unemployment inequities. That report also showed if we can erase those inequities, we would increase GDP by 2%. And so I think the president was able to put a national narrative, really get behind and encourage the efforts that were already underway, but also bringing lots of new leaders to the table. And what we've seen is not only, I think, did the president help to spark this great movement, but really start to create a fire. There are now more than 250 My Brother's Keeper communities all across the country, where mayors, tribal leaders, local elected officials like county executives are putting together strong collective impact plans with bold goals. In Philadelphia, for instance, they have a goal to reduce juvenile arrests by 50%. They have a resource plan and they have a timeline and a path to get there. We've seen an incredible investment from the private sector, more than $500 million in private sector investment that have been committed since the president launched My Brother's Brother's Keeper. And not, press releases. The My Brother's Keeper Alliance that launched with almost $100 million in solely private sector investment that they're going to start turning over to communities. And that will be here long after the president leaves office. And you've also seen philanthropy step up in a major way. I think there was a Chronicle on Philanthropy article that shows we're trending towards a tripling in investment towards programming on boys and young men of color. And from a policy perspective, extraordinary. Our chairman, Broderick Johnson, and I were just with the Attorney General and the Secretary of Education at a Maryland correctional institution launching Second Chance Pell, where for the first time in 20 years, correctional institutions and colleges and universities will be able to partner to get experimental Pell grants in order to pay for inmates to get a college education. So we're returning them to society with skills. And so, I'm not worried about what happens when the president leaves office. I think there's a powerful movement. And the president has also said this is not something he's only working on for the next 18 months, but something that he's going to work on for the rest of his life. And so if you've seen what former presidents have done and you see the passion that the president puts into this work, he's going to have your back for a long, long time to come. And I think we're starting something powerful here.
For more than a year now, I've had the pleasure as a journalist to follow what's happening with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I know they like to say that they're leaderless, but there are hundreds of young leaders who are pushing and fighting every single day. Interestingly, many of them are LGBTQ and women driving this. But I wonder for each of you, how do you tap into the energy and the fire of this movement? And has it helped or has it complicated your missions in your respective places? How about you?
Yeah, I'll start it off with saying that at the Brotherhood Sister Soul, every summer we have a program called the Summer Liberation School, where the young people learn about past movements, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and then take on throughout the year a campaign in the Liberation Program. This year is definitely at the heart of it all what has been going on around the country with the murders of young people of color. And I think first off and foremost, something that I learned very, very early on was that the political was personal. And having that political education as a base of where you stand and what role you will play in the movement, I think is critical. We're not all going to be lawyers around it. We're not all going to be poets or artists. But finding a place and finding your power and tapping into that, I think it's also a spiritual journey. I think it's knowing where you stand in a work that takes entire lifetimes. And so, yeah, I think that's a powerful place that the Brotherhood Sister Soul nurtures is young people's political education and where they stand.
And Angela, so many of these young people are so engaged, and it's interesting to see their maturation and the sophistication in the way they're presenting their ideas. Campaign Zero is a great example of that. But so many of them have pushed back against not just respectability politics, but engaging on a certain level with their elders, those who have been here and done that time and again. Have you had any interactions with the movement, and how best do you think folks who are interested in harnessing that energy and helping guide those folks, how best can they do so?
Yeah, that's a really personal question for me because I do claim to be one of those elders, and I have had interaction with young people, and they have pushed back, and it's very challenging because in many ways I don't think I could be more committed, though we could all be more committed. But I appreciate my own commitment, and I appreciate the history of it and the decades of it, and started off on the streets, making the same kind of demands with the same kind of passion. And so I understand why there is skepticism, suspicion, distrust, and impatience. If it was on your watch and it still looks like this, what have you got to tell me? I get that. And I know that I do have a lot because I've been so many things. I've been an organizer, I've been a community builder, I've been a foundation executive, a policy executive. And I know that my generation, those who have stayed committed and have learned, have something to give. and I understand why it is not being grabbed up. My hope is that we can get past this quickly, because I have nothing but respect, if not awe, for the young people who are out there on the streets. Oh my goodness, I am in awe of their courage and their commitment. I'm also in awe of their sophistication and their policy savvy and the absence of ego. I mean, we can't call out who the leaders are because they haven't pushed themselves in front of the camera to say I'm the leader. They have learned everything. And there are things that we can do along the continuum to make sure we make the most of this moment. So I come to your question with, I wake up thinking about it every day, asking how can I do better? How can I learn more? How can I be of service? And at the same time, being willing to just step aside and say, take it. If you can get it over the line, you take it.
Raymond, I want to ask you, I just got back from the Standing Rock Reservation, North Dakota, just a week and a half ago. And in speaking to young people there, they are angry and they are frustrated. But there is a sense that the soil just isn't ripe enough because there are so many maladies in that community, social, economic, and otherwise. But you pointed to the rates of state-sanctioned violence against Native peoples and indigenous peoples and communities. Why do you think we haven't seen a spark from that community yet? What is it?
That's a good question. I think, so last year I at this meeting in Oakland, I sat on a panel, a reflection panel, and really talked a little bit about, questioned how inclusive the movement was. And since then, I will say that there's been a lot of momentum that's been generated in Indian country around the work of empowering young boys and men of color, and youth in general. I think a lot of that has to do with not only the My Brother's Keeper initiative and sort of the publicity that's been gained for Indian country with that initiative, but also the White House created a Generation Indigenous initiative late last year, also looking to empower opportunities for Native youth. So I think these types of national movements have huge significance in Indian country, and maybe not play out on your local news, and maybe not play out in the front pages of the New York Times, but definitely in terms of local community organizing, it's happening, it's occurring, and there is a movement building in Indian country. I think where the disconnect comes in is over the question of who's going to lead this movement, and perhaps with the Black Lives Matter movement, and in terms of that movement not needing a leader in Indian country, I think what we tend to see at First Nations is a lot of pressure is put on tribal government to lead these types of things and these types of movements. And the question I have is, should tribal government lead these types of movements and efforts? And the reality is, from my perspective in our work at First Nations, who's going to lead these movements are not only youth and community organizing at the grassroots level, but also the nonprofit sector in Native communities. Government's not going to lead. So I think these national movements do have huge primacy when it comes to what's taking place in Indian country. And again, it may not get the attention of national headlines, but there's a movement there, and it is indeed building.
Macy, across this country, you look at here in New Orleans, you look at Chicago, you look at any major city, and the number of young people who are not only getting caught up in the pipeline, but are victims of gun violence, all manner of gun violence, all manner of what some would say an overreach by local authority. But is there a sweet spot where you found that you all have been able to make some impact and save those who are so vulnerable to so much?
Well, I think that narrative, and I'm assuming you're talking now about young people specifically,
young people,
versus
yes.
their parents or their caregivers, who also need a lot of support. I think that what we often do is we have to support the groups that work, not just in the trenches, but digging new trenches, because we have great allies at the Youth Justice Coalition in LA that continues to push us. Every time I read one of their emails, they're literally creating another narrative about a story of state-sanctioned violence, political oppression in terms of not being able to seek a remedy or gain any type of reparation, where the family is also suffering immensely. And so I think that we actually have to support what it really takes to organize, mobilize, and invest in those who are most impacted. Because similar to Black Lives Matter, it pushes us. It pushes all of us to think more critically about whether or not what we think is the trench is the trench. It pushes all of us to think critically about privilege, about power and access. Even in doing this work for a long, long time, we can sort of make the movement about something that is very predictable, which is funding, which is policy campaigns, which is what will play in the media. And so for the groups that continue to, folks have been working on these issues for decades, and it always breaks my heart to know that our allies have been working to end mandatory minimums and do criminal justice reform for decades before this past few years, where it's now suddenly getting all this attention. They're still behind. They're still underfunded, under-resourced, and marginalized. Their members are still not seen and brought into leadership tables to speak. And so we all, I think, have to be very strategic about how we create this narrative going forward. And so, a lot of times when you talk about state-sanctioned violence as well as the trauma and the healing that has not occurred yet, and to where communities and families are also fighting with one another, we have to go to the experts, and the experts are often not anyone but those who have lived the experience. And we have to get out of their way, as well, and we have to ensure that, and I'm going to also push the envelope here, is that many of their parents went through the same things, and maybe their grandparents went through the same things, and we leave them out completely as if they're just automatically part of the problem, or they're just innocent, passive bystanders, and aren't somehow going through an incredible amount of pain by watching the cycle get repeated over and over again despite their best efforts. So I just think we really have to be very, very aggressive and assertive about looking at the narrative that we're creating and making sure that we're not leaving people behind because we're going for the more palatable victory in this work.
Achila, in America, in this kind of broad discourse that we're having, identity plays such a critical role. And we're at a place now where it's this interesting kind of confluence of what's happening in the street and policy, and also the idea that our lives do matter in a way. When you talk about Brazil, what role does blackness and identity and the indigenous identity play in terms of the way the conversation around efforts aimed at those specific groups, the marginalized groups in Brazil, what role does identity play?
It's a growing role in the sense of for a long time, racism has been ignored as part of the dynamic of building power and informing inequality there. Even among the progressive, so-called progressive, or the left, or the human rights organizations. It's very recent somehow in the history of Brazil that racism has been recognized as a central dimension of how power is distributed and how violence is distributed. And that's not been an easy process. And we must be very conscious that the only reason that we are where we are today in terms of engagement, mobilization, participation of youth from the peripheries, from the community's direct effect, is merit of them. I mean, they were the ones who never silenced. They were the ones who, in spite of to be ignored by the mainstream organizations, the mainstream movements, the mainstream political parties, their families, their youth, the victims, they never silenced. They were there crying and saying, we are here, we are being submitted to this violence. So it's very important in the moment that we live today that we find ways to get out of their way. Help, if you can't help, get out of their way. Because they are really pushing hard for change at this point. And maybe the biggest challenge we have at this point is how you connect the dots, how we acknowledge the anger, the impatience, the frustration and the deficits they see in the mainstream organization in terms of responding to their needs, So we have to acknowledge that, but also connect that with the history of democracy in Brazil, with the history of overcoming so many things over the last 30 years. But still, when you look at the issue of violence, for instance, it's so shocking. We have every year 30,000 people below 29 years old, between 15 and 29 years old, who are killed. 30,000, well, we're talking about 86 young people a day. We are talking about 2 airplanes can get on the crashing every day. 77%, almost 80% are black. So all of a sudden, we need to push through the society that reality. We need to recognize that racism has been part of it's not the only one, but it's probably central on the structure of power and the structure of violence.
Michael, as we're in the midst of this kind of season of unrest and pushing across the country, a lot of young activists have introduced what had been very radical language. They say we're kind of still dealing with the last vestiges of white supremacy and the structures and all the tentacles that are part of that. How does the administration balance the idea of engaging with so many of these groups that are talking about white supremacy and kind of scary to a lot of people, but also addressing the very real needs? Politically, I'd imagine that's tricky, and we've seen that play out as much. But can you give us a glimpse behind the curtain at how you all deal with that?
Yeah, you know, I think this has been one of the most open White Houses that we've had, and certainly a president that appreciates the role of community organizers. Personally, you know, I spent a lot of time working in civic technologies, and I was so worried that this new generation would think that clicking a button was enough to be an activist. And so I have been so encouraged to see on the front lines all over the country, young people getting in the way and getting in trouble to make a difference in the democracy. I mean, civic engagement it's the fuel that fires our democracy. And so at the White House, you know, we have public meetings, we have private meetings, but we keep our finger on the pulse. The My Brother's Keeper Federal Task Force, we're talking to folks all the time. The Community Policing Task Force, we're having meetings with young activists all over the country. I would say there's been no shortage of us really reaching out to get the opinions of leaders at all different parts of the spectrum. We were with Marian Wright Edelman just a couple days ago, and then a couple weeks ago we had the young men that marched from Baltimore to Washington, D.C. and to meet. So we want to hear from them, we want to engage folks, because after all, this will not spark a movement. This will not lead to lasting change if it's just about President Obama. It has to be about average, everyday citizens, young people taking ownership of their democracy and making a real difference. And so we're engaging in all sorts of different ways.
Now, before we take a few of your questions and also field a few questions from Twitter, I would love it if you guys had some questions for each other. If there's anything that you want to know about your neighbor, your brother and sister sitting next to you, this would be a good time to do so.
Oh, I would love to ask Raymond a question. I'm very curious to know what you might want to see happen different in terms of building the relationships and the solidarity that we need.
You know, I think, so the opening question that talked about places of difference, I think in many places that's probably not a good place to start in terms of when we talk about how do we build bridges and work together to overcome many of these issues that are institutional, structural, and deep embedded within histories of inequality and racism. I think acknowledging similarities, I think, is one place to begin, and talking about what's similar. Education dropout rates for Native youth and other communities is the same, is similar. Incarceration rates are similar. State-sanctioned violence is similar. But I think acknowledging that those solutions are not similar is, I think, where I would like some of the conversation to go, and realizing that, you know, in reservation communities, taking to the streets on a Pine Ridge or a Rosebud is not going to have the same effect as it does in a New York or a DC. But acknowledging and respecting the organizing that does go on there, and that it may be different and it may look different, and And it may be different because of kinship relationships or the way people interact differently. But I think respecting sort of those aspects of difference in terms of how we organize for solutions is in my mind, one place that we can begin to talk about how things may look different across different communities.
Any other questions from you guys?
I have one. I wanted to ask Angela a question. It's on the heels of your self-reflective answer about the tender but challenging moment of getting pushback from younger folks. Interesting enough, when Cadre started, actually our parents, our parent leaders wanted, when they thought about building Cadre, they actually wanted to start where, and this is quoting them, where the civil rights movement failed or didn't finish, or looking at what people fought for that got them killed. And so I'm curious, I guess, as we think back on this moment of critical self-reflection, I think is really about what are we all doing and how are we getting in the way, even if we think we're not, that humility that at some point we have some power and privilege and we may not be redistributing, even though we're strong advocates and we're visible and we're opinion makers and we're shaping things. But I do think that when I think about what people are actually going through, it does feel like we have to accept where we have fallen short in a much more active part of the narrative. It's almost like we can't admit it, and then we don't want to, and then when we get called out on it, it's awkward. And so I'm just curious if there's what you would propose as a way to kind of really bridge the critical self-reflection that is needed so that we can build bridges with younger generations that want that transparent, honest, acknowledgement of where things have fallen short.
So the question is, how do you build in the moments for critical self-reflection, or what is the critical self-reflection?
Well, both. And how to link it to, the critique that is coming.
Well, this is a deep conversation we're having up here, isn't it? But when I try to be critically self-reflective about the challenge that we all face, and I face it as part of the movement that I'm very much in, I would have to say that if I am to own a fault in it, that it is an ability to stay with the times to create change. And I would call it both an asset and a fault. It is clearly an asset when you are committed to making change to know what time it is. And I always tell people that, know what time it is, and I have been saying it for the past 3 years, because we're in the most exciting moment I've ever seen. Know what time it is. That we're at a moment when the nation needs for people of color to do well, understand that, and don't act as if you're not in that moment. I say know what time it is because we're at a moment when people of color can and are identifying themselves as never they have before. Know what time it is and be a part of a coalition. I also say that our country is in trouble in terms of the economy. It is not turning around. Know what time it is and think about how to put your arguments in the economic language. If you are a person who always knows what time it is, sometimes you can forget what time it was. Sometimes you can forget what time it was. You can forget that people are stuck in the past. You can forget that, was it Mark Twain who said the past isn't even the past? Or no, it was not Mark Twain, it was Tennessee Williams, I think, but one of you will correct me. But at any rate, that understanding the past isn't even the past for a lot of people. And so my self-reflection is so much being in the present to be able to make change in the current context that perhaps I haven't stayed in touch with the past as much as I should have.
We actually have I'm not sure we can continue after that. We want to drop the mic. We do have a few good questions that we've fielded from Twitter. And so this actually kind of ties into the conversation we're having now. How do we support an infrastructure for sustaining a movement that has no walls?
That's a great
I mean, I'll
question.
start,
Yeah,
but
good.
I certainly don't think it'll be the end, which is that, you know, I think that a lot of times when we're organizing, mobilizing, we're responding, there is a certain amount of a present moment reaction and response. But I actually think that what I have seen in our parent organizing work last is just really investing in the critical analysis of all the folks who are in this work. Seasoned, you know, brand new, everything in between. I feel like we have to own that we can be and we can walk the talk of a new world order. We have to actually not externalize it so much so that it's dependent on a project or an organization. It has to be how we move in the world, you know? So if I have a value as a cadre of value, we do X, well, that I need personally to move in the world that way. And it sustains it because it goes beyond the funded work, if you will. It goes beyond the project. And I think that all of our lives are political projects at this point. I think parenting is a political project. I think we have to equip folks to walk systemic change in their own lives, you know, and actually expect it from the institutions that they're engaging. So.
Marian Wright Edelman uses a phrase which I often quote, which is assign yourself. And I think trying to create an infrastructure that sustains a movement, it requires that people assign themselves. They see what needs to be done and they do it, and they do it. And then you try to make sure that it fits in and it complements what others are doing. But you can't wait for instructions. You got to assign yourself and act boldly.
This next question actually kind of pivots nicely from that. This is one that we've seen playing out across the country, especially in this time we're in now. The question is, what is the role of the white ally in the black men, boys of color movement? The idea of allies, and we've seen this play out in different measure across the country.
No, I don't know how to answer.
I could
Yeah,
say
that's what
something.
actually earlier, that's what he said earlier.
Since I'm not from here, I can talk from Brazilian perspective.
That'd be perfect.
Well, a lot what we have achieved in terms of moving the process forward is through building alliances, strong and consistent alliance. But it's very important in doing that, you recognize who is the protagonist of each struggle. And you should not, you should in any way to try to replace that. So the protagonists on the black people of color movement are the black person. He and she should be the ones who lead. But that not means that should lead on an isolated way. So in Brazil, we have been exercised a lot this challenge in a completely different context, as I was saying, in the context of denial of racism, in a context where that society think that like to think about ourselves as a racial democracy, which we are not. So for the moment being to recognize the protagonism of the young black men, the young black women in the struggle is fundamental. But that does not exclude that we can work together in many different
Now, this is a panel full of people of color. And I think with these conferences, sometimes folks can't walk away with practical tips. So with the idea of white allies, what are some tips for white allies? What are some of the keys? Because you need to build these partnerships, build these allies, and build these bridges. Are there a few tips that they can walk away with, that folks in this room can go back to their white allies and say, here are a few steps to be a better partner in this?
I'll say a few things. In Indian country, I think naturally many organizations may be suspicious of white allies. I think the history has suggested that when white allies come in, they want to control and dictate and own the work. And I don't think that's always the case. But I think if we talk about white allies in the work of Indian country, I think we need to talk about the strengths that they bring to building and sustaining a movement. And I think some of those include voice. I think that a white person will get a different response when they talk about some of these issues than an Indian person in different venues. And that's not to say they should speak for Indian people or other minorities of color, but but be there to support and elevate the voice of people of color. That's one thing.
I have several practical tips. One is for those of us who are working on these issues to understand that just as Raymond talked about, the circumstance can be the same across the board. There are a lot of white people who are in the very similar circumstance to the one that we talk about in terms of education, in terms of poverty, in terms of homelessness, in terms of hunger, in terms of not having any political voice. Sometimes when I talk about what's happening with poor rural white people, and often a poor person from the audience who is white will come up to me and say, thank you, I go to these conferences all the time and nobody ever pulls out my circumstance. So a practical tip for us is to be specific about what's going on with a lot of white people who actually need every policy and strategy that we're talking about to improve their circumstance. Another is for people who are white and who are involved in this change work, whether you're running a policy organization or an organizing network or a university or whatever it might be, to understand that part of your role is to be the role model for what you say you're down with your allies for wanting. You need to be running a diverse organization. You need to make sure that your boards are diverse. And you need to make sure that that diversity gets at the equity issue, people who are really going to be advocates and talk about what's going on in terms of racial equity. And the other thing is that we have to, if you are white, we need to make sure that you're talking about it in terms of why it's important to you. That yes, I hope you will do this because it's the moral thing to do, but I hope you will also believe the argument that if we don't get it right for people of color, we don't get it right for the nation. If we don't get it right for people of color, we don't get it right for the world. So if you're in the world or you're in the nation, you have an agenda, and you need to talk about it from that point of view. And I think that's how you build authentic allies.
This was excellent. So we just have a few minutes left, and this was certainly an engaging, exciting kickoff to this conference. But we want to squeeze out every bit of engagement out of you folks in the time we have. So I want to bring up Micah Gilmer, senior partner at Frontline Solutions, to talk a little more about what you all can do to create these open, honest spaces here at the conference. Micah?
Thanks, Jermaine. So this week, we got it off to a good start, and as you can see, we're not going to pull any punches. We're going to have the conversation that we need to have to move this work forward. We want to engage with you in several different ways. If we go to the next slide, the first thing we want to see is let folks know who are not in this room about our live stream. We have live streaming going on for all the plenary sessions in here, and also select workshops as well, where folks can connect, be a part of this work, be a part of the conversation. We also want to bring those folks, as well as other folks across the country, in through social media. So tweet at AGOL Leaders if you want to give us a direct message, or tweet at us. Also the hashtag AGOL15 throughout the conference. In these individual sessions, we'll also have hashtags where folks can post questions, can be part of the conversation, and sort of be in the room in that way. And so we really want this to be as interactive, as engaging as possible. Next, and Jermaine and other folks have already given us a great shout out in terms of the conference app, but it's really important for you to download that app. And I'll give you another reason to download it in just a second. But one of the most important reasons is because it's the way that we're going to connect to you throughout the conference. And as things are happening and as things are progressing, as the conversation is unfolding, it's a way for us to connect with each other. It's also a great way for you to connect with one another. So there are opportunities there where folks have linked their social media profiles. You can send folks a direct message. Let's meet up, let's have a drink, let's have some coffee, and talk a little bit about how we move our work together forward using the app that way. So that's going to be an important tool for you to have in your toolkit here at the conference. One of the ways that we want to use that app is to help us facilitate what we're calling pop-up sessions. And so it's great for us to be able to curate these amazing folks on the stage here and in the workshops that are going to be sort of giving us their own perspective and knowledge and understanding. One of the things that we heard from you very clearly over the last few years is that we need some space to deal with stuff that comes up, right? So there may be questions that came up, ideas that came up in this conversation, things that will happen in the morning that may spark your interest or may make you think differently about what it takes to move this work forward. There may be some spaces that we need to create to talk about issues of gender in this work and gender-based violence, spaces to talk about the ways that different communities and different populations can connect together to do this work, spaces to talk about the specific issues of the community that you're from. And so to do that, we're going to be facilitating a pop-up session process. So you have until tomorrow morning at 10:45 a.m. to suggest a session topic. Right outside these doors in the back of the room, there's an area there. We have some whiteboards where you can write your proposed session topic. We have a nice little helpful illustration here. So you'll be greeted by a friendly frontline staffer who's got a nice wave and a creepy smile. I actually asked him to do that. So this is not, Joe's awesome. I asked him to do that. And then, so then you'll be greeted, you'll be given a pen and instructions on how to do that. We'll have you write both your session topic and then also importantly, your name, because you're gonna be sort of on the hook to help us pull that together if it's one of the sections that are picked. And then if you can see that last piece, after we have all of the session topics in, we'll sort of group some together and pull them together and sort of curate them, and then you'll get a chance to actually vote on which session topics that you'd be most interested in attending. And so from there, we'll be able to assign rooms to those sessions. So a session that's going to have 50 people in it or something like that, we'll give it a bigger room. A session that may be an important conversation that's going to happen with a smaller group of people, we'll give them a room. And so through your app, you'll get a notification about where that room is. And so if you're the session leader or you're interested in attending that session, you'll get that notification that way. So again, that's why it's important. It's not just a bell and whistle, it's really a tool that we're going to use throughout the course of the convening. Next, after this session, immediately following this, we have a reception. It's right here in the building in Storyville Hall, which is actually right across the way. We'll have staff to point you in the direction there. And then we start again first thing in the morning together in this room to really push this conversation forward. I'm really excited about the conversation in the morning because we're going to dig even more into the ways that our work intersects together. So thank you so much. Excited to get this conference started, and we'll see you all at the reception and then in the morning. Thank you.
That's good. That's all right. That's all right. That's good.
It was a pleasure.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. That was really good.
My brother's keeper.
Hush now, child, and don't cry. Your folks might understand you by and by. Just move on up toward your destination. Though you may find from time to time complications. Bite your lip and take the trip. Though there may be wet road ahead and you cannot slip, just move on up for peace you'll find. Into the steeple of beautiful people where there's only one kind. So hush now, child, and don't cry. Your folks might understand you by and by. Move on up and keep on wishing. Remember your dream is your only scheme, so keep on pushing. Take nothing less than the supreme best. Do not obey rumors people say, but you can pass the test. Just move on up to a greater day. With just a little faith, if you put your mind to it, you can surely do it. Just move on up. Move on up. But move on up. Watch out. Thank you.